In 1956, you and I graduated from Carnegie Mellon University. Over the years, we've had a lot of conversations. I figured after 55 years I might know something about you. But every time we talk, I learn something more. Like yesterday, when you told me for the first time the story about giving a lecture at the Vatican and telling the Pope what he should do with Galileo. So this evening, I'm really looking forward to hearing more stories about the steps on the path to being Ed Feigenbaum. So we have to start by rolling back. Let's roll back to 1994. That was a good year. That was a good year to be Ed Feigenbaum. Because Ed Feigenbaum in 1994 won the ACM Turing Award, which is the Nobel Prize for Computer Science. He won that jointly with Raj Reddy. Maybe you should read the citation here.
Before I do, I got to say that already Arnold's not telling the truth, because I actually met him in 1952. We were both undergraduates, we were both fraternity brothers, and I knew him for our whole undergraduate life, and then we graduated. The ACM citation said, this was incidentally joint with Raj Reddy, and most of you in the audience know Raj. Raj was one of our students at Stanford. I consider him Stanford's greatest gift to Carnegie Mellon. And then he went to Carnegie Mellon, and the rest is history. But in 1994, he and I both won the Turing Award for pioneering the design and construction of large-scale artificial intelligence systems, demonstrating the practical importance and potential commercial impact of artificial intelligence technology. So you want me to comment on that?
Well, you told me once that you would have written that some other way.
Well, let me focus on a couple other things that that I would have mentioned in the citation. The citation, read literally, it talks about the design and construction of large-scale artificial intelligence systems. That's a very engineering-sounding job. Well, the motive of getting into that area was not an engineering motive at all. It was a scientific motive. It was a motive to extend the work of the first generation of artificial intelligence researchers. It started with, actually with Newell and Simon at Carnegie Mellon, and went through about from 1955 through 1965 to extend that into the area of empirical induction. Newell and Simon had been working on problem-solving methods. For example, we'll talk later about heuristic search or means-ends analysis. The tasks that they used to further this scientific research were relatively simple tasks of either theorem proving or puzzle solving. And in my view, the larger cognitive task that we do all the time is the task of empirical induction, making sense of what one of the philosophers called the blooming bloody confusion of the world, all the data that's pouring in. And we are constantly making models, building little theories about our world, and occasionally those little theories are not so little at all. Occasionally they're big major scientific theories. So I wanted to explore that whole space. What do you have to add to what Newell and Simon had to say, and other people in the first generation? What do you have to add to that to get to really good empirical induction? Now, we did indeed make a major discovery down that route, and it's a major scientific discovery, and it conditioned the way that not only AI people, but also most computer scientists viewed the world of constructing large and interesting programs. We were, the discovery is the one that originally I called the knowledge is power hypothesis, and I borrowed knowledge is power from Francis Bacon. Of course, he used it in a political context. I was using it in a technical context, meaning that intelligent programs behave at high levels of intelligence, that is, solving complex problems, to the extent that they are very knowledgeable about their universe, their domain of discourse, knowledge about the task. And that as a corollary of that, the inference processes that are used in doing that problem solving play a relatively minor role. Now, this is very much counter to the theme of the first generation of AI science. We'll talk about 1956 and the great work at Carnegie Mellon, which was then Carnegie Tech, incidentally. We'll talk about that in a moment. But in 1958, one of the co-founders of AI, truly great computer scientist, one of my Stanford colleagues, John McCarthy, gave a paper at the first AI conference held in England. It was called the Mechanization of Thought Processes Conference. And his paper was called Programs with Common Sense. But the emphasis in the paper was not about common sense. It was about the idea that one would use the entire armada of mathematical logic, particularly 20th century mathematical logic, to blast open a whole problem of how to solve complicated things in the world. AI would be built out of those formal systems.
Let's move back from that a minute. Step back. You referred to it in a minute to kind of build a little foundation under what you're talking about. What was the great Christmas breakthrough of 1955, 1956? You called it a supernova that took place at Carnegie Tech.
Yeah, let me get to that, and just I just want to finish this one thought. That as we were, when I say we, I mean myself and Joshua Lederberg at Stanford, Nobel Prize-winning geneticist who collaborated with me on this work, and one of my young research associates at the time, now a famous computer science professor, Bruce Buchanan. We were solving problems in the mass spectrometry of organic molecules. Now, that's quite different, incidentally, than the toy puzzles that were being done in the early 60s by AI people. But what became clear was that as we, to use a chemical metaphor, as we titrated more and more knowledge into the systems, first about alcohols, then about sulfur-bearing compounds, and so on, then up to ring structures, the program became ever more intelligent in the sense of solving problems that only Ph.D. level scientists in the field could solve. And so that became, I called it the knowledge is power hypothesis, but we proved it again and again and again in dozens of systems in our laboratory and hundreds and thousands of systems out in the real world, that one had to build a great deal of knowledge of the world into these programs in order for them to behave intelligently. To twist a phrase of Fred Brooks's, he used it for some other purpose, but I'll use it in this context. There's no silver bullet. You have to know what you're talking about, and that's where the 10 years of work goes in that Herb Simon once talked about, or that Malcolm Gladwell now talks about 10,000 hours of sustained effort in building up that knowledge in some particular field. So that was the great aha. That was the great, what you might call the scientific breakthrough of the time, when most of computer science was focused on algorithms. And AI in particular was focused on problem-solving methods. Now,
So that was what you call the knowledge principle.
knowledge principle, yeah.
So it's the idea that it's the amount of knowledge about the domain of work that matters. It's not the reasoning.
Yeah. I'll go back and answer Arnold's other question about the 1956 era, but we used to, I don't have a, we were going to have a big pad to write on, but we used to draw this diagram of what we called a knowledge-based system, which was a big box that was called the knowledge base, and over here there was a big box called the inference engine, and the two would talk to each other, and the user would watch this interaction, and out of it would drop solutions, diagnoses in medicine, therapies, engineering solutions, with explanations about how the program arrived at that conclusion. Well, the actual truth of the matter was that the first box was absolutely enormous, and the second box was absolutely tiny, just big enough to fit in Aristotle. All you needed was something like, if you know A and A implies B, then you know B, or modus ponens, A implies B, B implies C, implies A implies C. Just a little bit of backward chaining, a little bit of forward chaining was just about all you needed. Mostly you needed all of that knowledge. So I've even, and we may get to this later on in the conversation, I even believe much further, I believe that box is even smaller than that. Maybe Aristotle wouldn't even fit into it.
Let's get back to Ed's life story.
1956 is what.
1955, 1956, Christmas. You've talked about Simon and Newell, but you haven't talked about who they are, or what happened at Christmas, what the supernova was, and why were you there anyway?
Yeah, good questions. Let me give you the Feigenbaum's story, and let me give you the GSIA story. I guess that anyone who's attending this meeting knows what GSIA is, right?
No.
No? Graduate School of Industrial Administration on the Carnegie Mellon campus in Pittsburgh, which was almost brand new at the time that Arnold and I met each other, 1952. I got to Carnegie Mellon age 16 as an engineering student. I, as a kid, really was interested in science, and I didn't know anything about engineering. I had actually never heard the word, but astronomy, mathematics, etc. And I saw an advertisement for scholarships that were being offered at Carnegie Institute of Technology. Those were the Westinghouse scholarships. I didn't win one of those, but I won an analog of one of those, same scholarship. And that allowed me to get away from home. So I took that. I might have ended up at MIT, but I wasn't at the Bronx High School of Science where they knew there was an MIT. So I ended up at Carnegie Tech and cruised through my first year as an engineering student with almost all A's. And so but I was getting really bored with it, and I was looking for something that was broader than engineering. My thought was, this can't be the whole world. There's got to be more to the world than this. And I browsed through the catalog, and I asked my undergraduate advisor, whom, if you're old enough, you know him, Ed Schatz. And Ed Schott said, gee, with your grades, you can just take anything you want. So I found this course over in way on the other side of campus in this unknown place called GSIA, called Ideas in Social Change. It was a graduate level course, and I was a 17-year-old sophomore. And I wandered over there, and guess who was teaching that course? That was Jim March, now one of the most famous people in political science and sociology and education. But Jim was a brand new instructor, and the first thing he gave us to read was von Neumann and Morgenstern's Theory of Games. And wow, that really was mind-blowing, that there was such a thing. So this went on, and March got me a summer internship at Carnegie, working with him doing some social science experiments. In fact, that was my first published paper, was in the area of social psychology on decision-making in small groups, based on the work with March that summer. But March also did another miraculous thing. He introduced me to a completely amazing person named Herbert Simon. And I have to break off a moment and tell you a little bit about the history of GSIA as I gleaned it from the web, actually, from the Tepper School history of GSIA. GSIA in those years, which is the years I'm talking about, staffed with people, very smart people, educated largely in the social science disciplines. Lee Bach, who started the school, was an economist. Simon, a political scientist. Some person later wrote in Fortune magazine that Simon's hiring, quote, was a signal to the academic community that a business school might be an appropriate place in which to work on profound, if less immediately relevant problems. And then they mentioned Bill Cooper, who was one of the founding people of management science and operations research. March, Hal Levitt in psychology. Alan Newell, a researcher at the Rand Corporation who had come to work with Herb Simon on what later became known as AI, and in fact, Newell and Simon and John McCarthy and Marvin Minsky are known as the founders of AI. Franco Modigliani and Mort Miller, who in economics and finance, both of those people won the Nobel Prize. Of course, so did Herb Simon. And then, just recently, one of the students that was in this environment, Ollie Williamson at Berkeley, he just won the Nobel Prize recently. So that's the kind of a place it was. And that's why I refer to it from time to time as a supernova. I mean, you might say that the Newell and Simon breakthrough was amazing, but it might have been just a nova. But when you have 4 Nobel Prize winners coming out of this one environment, that's really amazing. Bach described GSIA, this is the founding head of GSIA, as a, quote, hardball place, unquote, with, quote, no room for second-rate work, unquote, where, quote, everyone debated everything. So that's the environment in which this work was taking place. I took a course so I went on doing my engineering degree, eventually got a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering, same time, same graduation that Arnold graduated. And, but in the fall of 1955, which was the fall term of my senior year, I took a course from Herb Simon, graduate level seminar, 6 people in it. Imagine that, 6 people. And at that time, Carnegie Tech was not on the quarter system, it was on the semester system. So you came back after the Christmas break and you did some more work and then you took exams and then then the second semester started in early February. And Herb came in the first class after the new year, and he started out by saying, over Christmas, Alan Newell and I invented a thinking machine. It's an amazing thing to tell these 6 students, right? Like, what could he possibly mean by that? What do you mean by a machine? And how can a machine think? And what's he talking about? And so what he was talking about was a program called the Logic Theory Program. It's the first working AI program, the first what's called a heuristic search program. It was incidentally programmed in the very first Lisp processing language, IPL1. You all know about Lisp, and Lisp came much later. Lisp was McCarthy's work to make Lisp processing truly elegant and beautiful. But the IPLs came before that. And then Newell and Simon took this program to the workshop that's regarded as the founding workshop of AI, the Dartmouth Conference in 1956. And they showed up with a working program. When I say a working program, it was actually running on a machine called the Johnniac at the Rand Corporation. Those of you who want to see the Johnniac have a world-class opportunity to do it because it's 40 miles away on 101 Shoreline Boulevard. Go to the Computer History Museum. You'll see one of the greatest exhibits you'll ever see going on right now, and the Johnniac is front and center there. And IPL2 was running on the Johnniac, programmed by a great programmer, Cliff Shaw. And there was a program that was proving theorems in Volume 2 of Principia Mathematica, the attempt by Whitehead and Russell to formalize the basis of arithmetic and therefore all of mathematics. And it went through chapter 2 proving all of these theorems. In fact, in one case, it found I believe it was a 2-line proof or maybe a 3-line proof for something that took Whitehead and Russell 2 pages to prove. Simon wrote up that proof and sent it off to Bertrand Russell. Russell sent back a letter, which you can see online at the Simon archives at Carnegie Mellon, Digital Archives, Carnegie Mellon Library. Russell said in his return letter that he's now fully prepared to believe that a machine could do anything. That was really the birth of AI. One of the people attending the conference at Dartmouth that summer was Herbert Galernter from IBM. Herb Galernter went back, was so impressed that he did a program to prove theorems in plane geometry. And at the end, and he actually used a version of Fortran to do that, believe it or not. At the end of the year, when he had the program running, the geometry theorem proving program took the New York State Regents exam in Euclidean geometry, the one that they give to all the high school students. It was the only taker of the exam that year that scored 100%. So AI was really on the road. Jim Slagle at MIT did the machine that did various problems in calculus, and there were a variety of other activities. Newell and Simon's famous program, the General Problem Solver, and the chess program, the basis for Herb Simon's prediction in 1957 that in 10 years a machine would defeat the world's chess champion. Now, those of you who think on a grand scale will not be bothered by the fact that it didn't happen in 10 years, it happened in 40 years. I mean, 40 years is a minuscule piece of dust, right? But it did happen.
So, two questions. One, you've called this the period of no name for computer science, number one. And why was all this coming together at tiny Carnegie Tech instead of some big powerhouse school like MIT?
I call it the period of no name because no one knew exactly what to call this burgeoning, increasing level of scientific experimentation and theoretical work during the last part of World War II and the late 1940s. This kind of work was called cybernetics, which was really a label for mathematical control theory. But it really didn't encompass the information processing advances that were going on in the 50s. So let's say the working paper series that Newell and Simon put together was called a series in information processing. That was the name of the papers. The Carnegie Tech people, when they got organized to educate in this area around 1958, to make an educational program, they called it System and Communication Sciences. It wasn't until 1964 that someone named it computer science or computer sciences. That was, I believe, Purdue was the first one, and I believe Stanford was the second one to use the name computer science. So I refer to that early period. The Russians, the Soviet people, always called it cybernetics. They never left that name.
And this was happening at Little Carnegie Tech instead of the
Yeah,
MIT,
well, it was.
Because why?
To be fair, well, I can tell you why it was happening at Carnegie Tech. But I can also tell you that MIT was as much of a powerhouse as Carnegie Tech. I mean, the work going on at MIT was really, really impressive. Again, you have to go to the Computer History Museum and see some of the exhibits there to appreciate the MIT work. And they also had in AI McCarthy and Minsky as well. But at Carnegie Tech, it was happening primarily because of three people. Number one, Herb Simon. He was hired by Lee Bach in the late 40s, brought in as a genius to think profound thoughts and make everyone else think profound thoughts. Secondly, the person that joined Herb from the Rand Corporation, where Herb met him when Herb was a consultant out at Rand. Herb was doing some consulting in management science at the Rand Corporation and met Alan Newell. And Alan Newell was another genius. Up in the front row here is Gordon Bell, who co-authored a book with Alan. Alan Newell is known as one of the fathers of AI, but he co-authored a book with Gordon on computer architectures. I mean, he was just a great man. And the third person was a person that Simon found and convinced the Carnegie management to hire. And that was a person named Alan Perlis. And Alan Perlis was simply amazing. Alan Perlis was the first winner of the ACM Turing Award. Alan Perlis had a compiler running on a 2,000-word IBM 650 9 months before Fortran was released to the world. It was called IT, Internal Translator.
About that IBM 650, you said that was Ed's personal computer.
Well, after Simon told us of what a thinking machine was, we didn't have one at Carnegie, so he gave us 6 people in the class. He gave us Xerox copies, or whatever you called them at the time, photocopies or something. But anyway, copies of the IBM 701 manual. That was IBM's first entry into large-scale binary computation. Actually, a beautiful machine. in terms of its architecture. And I took it home that night and I read through it from cover to cover. It took all night long, and it was for me a born-again experience. The next morning, I woke up, or I left the house as what we would now call a computer scientist. And that was what I was going to do. So I applied for a job at IBM in the summer, and they had the first ever of their graduate student programs in the summer. I wasn't quite a graduate student yet, but I was going on to be a graduate student working with Herb Simon, so they let me in. And they taught me how to program not only the machine that Carnegie was about to get, which was the IBM 650, but also the 704, which was the successor to the 701s. And believe it or not, I even learned how to program a wired program, plug board, IBM card sorting machine type computer, tabulator, I guess it was called. 16 registers. How's that for memory? Now I got lost to where. So I got back to Carnegie, and the 650 was there. And the only people who knew how to program the 650 were Al Perlis, Joe Smith, who was working on IT, Art Evans, who I guess was a student at the time, and a couple people graduate students in GSIA, myself and Fred Tong. So that was it. The mathematicians weren't interested in the machine. That was a counting machine. It wasn't a mathematics machine. And the physicists couldn't care less. The engineers were staying away from it because they thought that if they got involved with this thing, that somehow Simon and Perlis would get them to fix the machine. And, so we had it all to ourselves. And so I would sit there at the console for hours and just poke away at the registers and the keys, and this big chain printer was next, clunkety, 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 clunk was sitting next to me, and it was exactly just like having my PC at home, my Mac at home. I have my printer there, and except things are a little smaller now. And that was a 2,000-word drum, so on that drum was, each word was 10 digits, so it's 20,000 digits, so essentially 20,000 bytes. And gee, well, I don't have it with me, but I have on my keychain something the size of my thumbnail, which is 4 gigabytes. So that personal computer was the one I did my PhD thesis on, which I can tell you about if you ask.
I'll ask. So you did your PhD thesis, EPAM, which we'll talk about in just a minute, with Simon. You were Simon's student.
Yeah.
So what was it like to be a student of Simon? I mean, what was his, I don't know, pedagogical method, or what happened?
I meant along the way to tell you something that someone once said to me about Herb Simon. This was a fraternity brother of Arnold's and myself named Murray Tallenfeld. Murray died a while back, but Murray happened to be an MBA student he was a little bit older than us, and he, therefore, a year or two ahead of us, and he went for his MBA at GSIA, and so he got to know Simon that way. And he once told me that, Ed, anything that you have ever thought of or ever will think of, Simon thought of before he was 13. And that's really like the way it was. So working with Herb Simon was not really a question of going in and taking a class and getting lectures from Herb. It was, Herb's view was that a PhD is a research training apprenticeship. And you treat it like you treat a normal master-apprentice relation. You work together on things, and whatever you need to know, you get to know either because you have to know it, because it's part of the task, it's part of the general milieu of the knowledge you need to do this work, and what you need to know about the methods by which you ask the right questions, prune the avenues in the search space of all things you could possibly do down to a few fruitful ones that have high payoff. You learn that by watching other people do it, people like Herb Simon and Al Newell and Al Perlis, people like that. So that was Herb's view of pedagogy. And there were no required classes for the Ph.D. In our school. When I came to Stanford, I kind of brought that attitude with me, and for years, maybe even now, there are no required courses for the Ph.D. at Stanford. It's just, that was the way. So let me give you an example. I came back from IBM in September of 1956, and I showed up in Herb's office, said, okay, now what? You know, now I'm here on he got me a fellowship, and now I'm here. What do we do? And he happened to have an issue of Scientific American out in front of him. There was an article in there about the learning of what the psychologists call nonsense syllables, and there was some phenomena that this guy named Rock was writing up, and he said, let's go after that. Let's see if we can do an information processing model that will predict these results. That was one of many, many articles that we were absorbing and trying to frame a theory that would be capable of predicting the measured results in that psychological area of elementary human learning.
So you did your PhD thesis, which you published in 1962, called EPAM, a psychological theory of learning and memory implemented as a computer program. I would like to gallop forward and go to 63. You published the book Computers and Thought with Julian Feldman. You stayed at Tech to work with Simon until 1965.
I left Carnegie. I took my PhD exam on one particular morning in September of 1959 and flew to New York, and later that day left on the Queen Elizabeth ship on my Fulbright to England, where I was for a year, and then I went to teach at Berkeley in I postponed my assistant professorship at the business school at Berkeley, which was the only place I could get a job. There was no computer science departments, remember? And the psychologists had not yet bought into all this information processing theory.
Okay, so you were at Berkeley.
So I was working with Herb Simon, what you might call long distance. Nowadays, it wouldn't seem bizarre because you could just send, half a dozen emails a day and send files back and forth. We were sending thick IBM printouts to each other across the country.
Then you moved from Berkeley to Stanford on January 1st, 1965.
Yes.
And you called 1965 the year of the big break. Why was that?
In the let me go back to Computers and Thought. That was Julian Feldman and I were also a student of Herb Simon's. We both got jobs at Berkeley. We were teaching a course in artificial intelligence, but there were no books on artificial intelligence. There were only in fact, there were very few journal articles. There were mostly conference proceedings papers. And we did photocopying of them for the students, but we realized we really had to put them together into a well-constructed collection. And that collection is a classic. It's still being sold now by MIT Press, called Computers and Thought. It has most of the sort of historically classic papers in the field. But I wrote the introduction to Computers and Thought, and in the introduction, I gave my reasons for thinking that the study of empirical induction would be the next big next big job for AI. And I was thinking for a long time, that was 1962 that I wrote that, and I kept thinking and thinking and thinking of what is the right task environment in which to explore empirical induction. And it eventually dawned on me that just as I had learned from Herb Simon that if you wanted to do AI, you might as well do it by studying I. That is, there were several billion of these eyes walking around on 2 feet. And they all did all the things that you wanted to do in these AIs. So why don't you really study them and understand how they were doing it? And when I asked that about empirical induction, I thought, gee, there's a subset of these people whose job it is to do empirical induction, and they're very analytic, and they're very they're thoughtful about what they do, and they're willing to tell you, because that's the way they live their lives, and that's scientists. Well, about that time, I went to a Saturday morning workshop that was held at the Center for the Advanced Study of the Behavioral Sciences, now part of Stanford, but it's on the hill behind Stanford. There I met Joshua Lederberg, the Nobel Prize winning geneticist, but again, another one of these amazing geniuses whose scope of knowledge and quest for understanding everything covered the world. And Lederberg he was particularly interested in computers at the time, and because of John McCarthy's discussing it with him, models of thinking built on out of computer language. So that's why he was at this Saturday workshop. When I told him what my interest was, but that I really needed a task, to use the formal language, I needed a task environment in which to explore this. If you want informal language, I needed a real-world playpen in which to play with these ideas, just the way Newell and Simon had used chess as a real-world playpen, or they had used trigonometric identities. I needed one for empirical induction in science. And Lederberg said, I have just the one for you. And he told me what he was working on. He was working on in his lab, the design of a planet probe, which ended up being the first Viking lander, that would search for life forms. They were looking for life on Mars, but they weren't expecting to find spiders crawling around. What they were expecting to find at most was life precursor molecules. And so in order to identify those, you would send along an instrument called a mass spectrometer, which would help. It's physical chemistry and analytic chemistry, and physical analytic chemistry that would identify what the structure of those organic molecules was all about. And as part of that, he was, in his laboratory, doing the mass spectrometry of amino acids. And so why didn't we just start with those? The induction problem was, given an array of data, which came from the mass spectrometer, namely the molecular weight of the fragments of these molecules versus the relative abundance of fragments at that weight, a two-dimensional spectrum, then what's the organic molecule? What's the C's and the H's and the N's and the O's? How are they connected? Not in three-dimensional space, but in at least topologically, and therefore identify it. And so that's what we started to do. And he had already programmed as incidentally, it was his exercise in getting back into computing after a long period of time when he had nothing to do with computers. But he had already programmed an algorithm which was capable of generating the space of all possible C's, H's, N's, and O's, given a certain number of each of those. However, that's a very large space for any significant molecule I mean large in the sense that we think of chess move spaces as being very large. These are very large spaces. And the question is, how do you use the empirical data from the mass spectrometer to prune that to get to the right answer? Or if you can't get exactly to the right answer, can you give the chemist at least 2 or 3 or 4 best answers? The general view there being that the chemist might know something that he didn't tell you, that you didn't know, that picked this one out rather than that one. So we didn't really give him the best. We gave him a short list of the best ones. And that's the way I mentioned before in when I called titrating knowledge into the system. We kept getting more and more and more and more and more of this knowledge. We invented the rule-based form of the knowledge, which has become the standard way of representing knowledge, not only in expert systems, but in business systems in general. Recently, I did a search in Google on the phrase business rules. Got more than 100,000 hits on business rules. And that was all started there with the Newell project representing mass spectrometry, chemical mass spectrometry, in those fragmentation rules.
So Newell became really the first.
So that was the big break.
Expert program.
Yeah, let me just say that for me that was a big breakthrough, break with the past, because remember the setting I had come out of and had worked for 5 years thereafter with Herbert Simon was psychology. We were doing an information processing model of human verbal learning behavior and seeing if we can publish papers about it in the Journal of Verbal Learning and Verbal Behavior. When I really looked down into myself, I realized that the reason I had gotten into this field wasn't that at all. I mean, for Herb, it was only that. He loved that. That was, he was a psychologist, and indeed he won the equivalent of the Turing Award in psychology, and so did Alan Newell. But I was really interested in doing what a statistician named I.J. Good, that Gordon will remember, I.J. Good in the 50s talked about the ultra-intelligent computer. That was his terminology. And really I was out after the ultra-intelligent computer. And eventually that became expert systems, but it was no accident that I was pushing things in the direction of expertise. That's what I was looking for, the world's best at something. And you know, it really
So this was the launch pad. So now what I'd like to do is to take a gallop through the rest of the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. During that period, you founded the Intelligent Systems Laboratory at Stanford. You directed Stanford's Computation Center. You chaired Stanford's Computer Science Department. In addition to those day jobs, you wrote 3 books, many seminal papers. You were the founding editor of McGraw-Hill Computer Science Series, and you founded 3 companies. You told me that you took a very important lesson from this period.
Oh, that must be what I probably told Arnold was, this is, I guess Nancy Reagan summarized it in just say no. But you have to learn how to say no. And if you don't know how to say no, you do all those things.
But you flunked.
But I think of all of those things that he just mentioned, the 2 that were the least fun were running the computer center and running the computer science department. I think if I had to do it all over again, I wouldn't have done those 2 things. Although Don Knuth, he's really at me for this computer science thing because he says, Ed, you really were a good chairman. You shouldn't say that. The business about the books was a quite deliberate strategy. That was not accidental at all. That wasn't just saying, oh, I guess it's time for me to write books. That was a deliberate strategy that came from the successes of not only Dendral, but several other expert systems projects that were working so well that it was almost unbelievable, like Ted Shortliff and Bruce Buchanan's work on Mycin, or the work on at DEC that Gordon helped push at DEC on configuration systems, and other work at our laboratory, Penny Nee and I worked on a very difficult problem that had to do with, a secret problem actually, having to do with finding Soviet submarines off the coast, off the continental shelf. And so I just saw that this field was going to have to be populated by a large number of people, and we were only training a small number of people, and it was us and a handful at MIT and a handful at Carnegie Mellon, and this was just not it. The world had to know about this. So lots of student labor, lots of student research, lots of editing, lots of careful organizing led to, actually it turned out to be 4 volumes of the Handbook of Artificial Intelligence, which turned out to be sort of the bestseller AI book for decades until the most recent textbooks came out. There was also the question of letting the rest of the world know about this. So it happened that the Japanese were doing, they decided that this work was important to them, and they launched a national project called the Japanese Fifth Generation Project. And so I and a writer colleague, friend of mine, Pamela McCorduck, who I knew way back from my Berkeley days, and she had written a wonderful book called Machines Who Think, which incidentally, a special 25th anniversary edition came out a few years ago, if you want to go get that book. Pamela and I wrote a book called The Fifth Generation. And I used that as a platform for telling the story of AI and expert systems and how the research at DARPA led to it, and what it means to do long-term work and have big payoffs and so on.
So we have to fast forward again to that great year, 1994. It was a good year for another reason. You changed jobs. You became chief scientist of the United States Air Force. Why? And what does a chief scientist do besides get free rides in F-15 jet fighters? I've seen a picture of you in flight suit and helmet, and you have this silly smile on your face like a kid in a candy store.
You actually get to do more than that. I actually was the second man in a one-seater F-16. The second man, of course, is for the training version of the F-16. We did aerial combat over the deserts in Arizona, and I actually flew a B-17 bomber for a while.
So you were there from
but anyway,
94 to 97.
Yeah,
you must have done something else.
As soon as I got to Stanford, I met somebody who, a professor who had been chief scientist of the Air Force, and he told me about the job and what a great job it was and how much fun he had in that. And then after he had gone from Caltech into that job, and then he came to Stanford. And so I knew about the job, and one day the phone rang, and on the other end was a person I had never met, but I was serving on a committee that she was chairing, Sheila Widnall from MIT in the Aero-Astro department, and she described the job of Air Force Chief Scientist and asked if I knew anyone who would be a good candidate for that job, because she was going to need somebody. She wasn't able to actually tell me on the phone at that time what was going on, but a few days later it was announced that she was going to be Secretary of the Air Force. And since I knew all about the job, I said, and she wanted to know if I was interested in the job. And it was in Washington, but take me away from Stanford stuff and my family. But I talked to Penny about it overnight and called her up the next day and said, yeah, sounds great, let's do it. So she asked for a 3-year commitment, and that's why it was 94 through 97. What the chief scientist of the Air Force does is, well, number one, the chief scientist works for the chief of staff of the Air Force, who's a 4-star. So ipso facto, if you follow the rule-based system, which is the Air Force or the Defense Department, ipso facto, you are a 3-star general. So I had the equivalent rank of 3-star general. which I'll tell you is really good to be. You know, outdoor windows on the E-ring. But what you get to be is the chief of staff's window on science, looking out at all of science that might be of use to the Air Force, but in particular looking at the laboratories that the Air Force runs. They run laboratories that cost them several $1 billion a year. They run a whole basic research program through AFOSR that costs hundreds of millions, maybe $1 billion a year. Plus, the Air Force needs a representative in the science circles of Washington, someone to talk to the NSF people, someone to talk to the chief scientist of the Commerce Department, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and so on and so on. Plus, the chief occasionally has a real scientific problem that he wants answers to, like, for example, the Scientific Advisory Board, a 60-member volunteer board of scientists advising the Air Force, was pushing him to start a project called the Airborne Laser. The Airborne Laser was going to be up there. It was going to be a gigantic version of the 747. We now call it the 747-800 or something like that. It's a huge version of it. It was going to carry a chemical laser, and it was going to shoot the beam through adaptive optics, and 250 miles at the end of that beam was going to be a whole, something about the size of a quarter, which will heat the side of a Scud missile as the Scud missile was rising. Remember, that was the time that the Iraqis were shooting Scuds at the Israelis, right? So you needed this airborne laser like tomorrow. Well, the airborne laser is still not finished. But he needed advice on, you know, what's up with this project. He needed scientific advice. I was not a physicist, so I couldn't comment on the chemistry of that or the power of that laser, but I could comment on what kind of system science would be needed and what kind of software would be needed to do that. And when I went to look at the contractors, in this particular case Boeing, and what they were doing, the answer was, in the software area, zero. As if it didn't exist, as if the problem didn't exist. They were going to solve the chemical laser problem first. And so the chemical laser problem eventually got solved, but the software problem didn't. But anyway, that was my job to, that's why Sheila Widnall wanted me there, to look at the software issues that the Air Force was facing. She knew that they were important. And chief scientists are normally aerospace people, or they're munitions people, or they're physicists. No one previously had been a computer scientist. They finally got the message, incidentally. The current chief scientist is not only a computer scientist, but another AI guy, Mark Mayberry.
So when you left the Air Force as a three-star general, you came back to Stanford, and you found that it was tough to go from macro scale back to micro scale.
So here, the attitude of your colleagues at Stanford, since Stanford is always sending people to Washington to do big deal things, like Dick Atkinson for 6 years was head of the National Science Foundation. Eventually he was president of the University of California. But you know, Condi Rice goes off and she was National Science Advisor and then Secretary of State, and people are always doing that. And here comes back this three-star general, and they, you know, oh, are you back? What are you teaching next quarter? Oh, introduction to AI. Oh, yeah, right, introduction. Well, I did that for a couple years, and then I said, no, I'm used to playing on a bigger stage. So, but it was about time to retire anyway, so I retired.
But you're still a professor emeritus at Stanford.
Yeah, I'm a professor emeritus, so-called recalled to active duty.
So we're closing in on the end of our conversation time. I've been receiving here questions from the audience, and most of them, I think, can be covered in one big question, which I'd like to ask on behalf of the ones that have come in from the audience, and there are a couple that we just don't have time to cover, for which I apologize to the contributors. The big final question that most of these cover is, for AI, looking forward, what are the big breakthroughs waiting to happen? You told me about 3 big breakthrough areas.
That's a very good question from the people in the audience who asked it, and Arnold, who asked me about that a few weeks ago. Let me answer it in 2 ways. Number 1, the AI field is the sum total of what the AI researchers are doing. So there's no word from on high as to what the AI field should be. It is what people do. And about 15 years, 20 years ago by now, AI people started to, down the road of, you can approach intelligence from the low levels upward or from the high levels downward. And high levels, I mean highly symbolic, extremely complex problem solving. Typical example would be Newell and Simon almost from the beginning working on chess playing programs, or my working with a Nobel Prize winning geneticist and a famous chemist on mass spectrometry. That's sort of high level stuff. Or you could work on it from the bottom up, like Raj Reddy. When I got to Stanford, Raj was John McCarthy's student, and he was working on speech understanding, trying to understand speech waveforms. That's very low level. And then working upward to higher levels of contextual understanding of the sentence, of the utterance. So high-level reasoning work in AI is not being done much anymore. And if you want to read a kind of an article that talks about it, this month's Wired magazine happens to have that as its special cover story. AI is here again, but it's not what you expected it to be. So, but I'm going to answer Arnold's question from the point of view of the high-level stuff. What I would do if I had another career in AI that's about to happen, which I don't have one about to happen, but the issue is modeling the processes of creativity. What does it mean to, what is a creative act? And what does it mean to discover something that is creative? So I would work, number 1, on that issue, because I think that issue is ripe for working on right now. And it's been largely ignored, even though there was an excellent article on it, the presidential address that Bruce Buchanan published in the AI magazine a few years ago, his presidential address for the AAAI presidency. I'm going to talk about that one a little more, but let me just mention that, let's see, I told Arnold there were 3.
Yeah.
Creativity was one of them.
Combinatorial creativity,
yeah.
Pattern recognition, and knowledge acquisition.
Yeah, okay. Let me talk about the knowledge acquisition one very briefly. If the diagram I described to you earlier is correct, that the big box is the knowledge box. You just have to fill up the knowledge box. If you want a program to know about everything, you have to have some way of getting that knowledge in there. And for most of us, the way, except for the common sense knowledge of working around the world, doing things in the world, which is a problem Doug Lennon has been working on for 20 years now, 30 years, in Texas. But other than that, if you want to do it in any specialty field, let's say chemistry, you don't say, why don't you just go out and find out about chemistry? What you say is, here's a book on chemistry, read this book. And we don't have any programs that read articles and books and learn knowledge of those domains from that reading. Now that's another problem that's really ripe for working on. We know enough about knowledge representation, we know enough about semantic processing. Our natural language understanding people are very, very good these days. It's all ripe for coming together. And indeed, the National Library of Medicine has been sponsoring research in this area, and DARPA made it its #1 thrust a few years ago. I don't know where it stands right now, but they were actually sponsoring research in that. So that was a third of them. The second of them was pattern recognition, and that's too long a story to go into, other than saying that that's where I want to squeeze Aristotle out of the box. I think that the way my feeling now is that the way we think is we have an immense number of very simple 1-level or 2-level rules in our head about almost everything. And we, to use the language of rule-based systems, we look at the left-hand side and do a match, and the right-hand side tells us what we're looking at or what to do. And that it isn't that we reason about that, we just know about that because we've seen it, and that's what the 10,000 hours is all about. So take here's the experiment that Herb Simon ran when he became interested in the problem of what is expertise. I think he got interested in it because of the work on expert systems. But you show a master chess player and a novice chess player boards that have action going on them. But you give each of them only a fraction of a second to look at the board. It's done with a machine called a tachistoscope. The master player sees, and to round the numbers to even numbers, the master chess player sees 100% of all the action, what's important. And the novice player sees 0% of all the action. Now that's what the master has been doing, like Bobby Fischer from the time he was 6 until he was 16. That's his 10 years for learning all of that. And when you watch the football games, as I do every weekend, and you hear the announcer say that so-and-so just sees the field and he sees it's unfolding in a way that he didn't expect, but he knew that guy was going to be open, whereas this guy that's only been in the league 2 years, he has to think about it, and he really didn't quite see that guy being open. Well, it isn't that the guy who was there 15 years thought about it. He has seen that happen so many times in practice, in games, that he just knows that configuration means that guy's open.
You summarized that by saying expertise is pattern recognition.
Yes. Thank you. So now I want to talk about creativity. And to talk about creativity, I have to go back to, let me give you a little story, and then I'll give you 2 examples beyond that story. Chess is a bounded game, 8x8 chessboard, 16 pieces on each side with limited mobility, and yet the number of possible routes from the beginning of a chess game to a win, loss, or draw is 10 to the 120th power. Inconceivably large number, more than you could store in all the particles that have spin in the universe. I mean, so the question is to find something good that is a satisfactory solution to a problem in that otherwise astronomically large space. Herb Simon coined a term, satisficing, to mean you're not looking for the sharpest needle in the haystack, you're just looking for a needle sharp enough to sew with. Now, we humans have very limited ability to look down into this enormous space. So if we're chess players, if we're not very good, we do, if I go here and he goes there, and I go here and he goes there, and we look at a few hundred things. If you're a master chess player, you know the patterns and you look at a few hundred things, but you don't look at 10 to the 50th things or 10 to the 20th things. There's a kind of a cone of things you look at. But within that cone, there probably will be some avenues that no one has ever gone down. Some avenues of do this, do that, do this, do that, do this, with the known parts that no one has ever gone down. And when you go down that, even if you stop at a certain point, because you can't go down a big space, you will be surprised with what you see. So let me tell you the story of Garry Kasparov and the interview he gave at the end of Game 3 of the match with Deep Blue, the IBM-sponsored Deep Blue match, where Deep Blue beat Kasparov. And in the third game, Deep Blue made an absolutely sensational move from a chess player's point of view, breathtaking move. And it completely threw Kasparov off, because he thought he knew how these programs worked. In fact, had studied the IBM program in the year before playing it, because he had played it the year before, and he had beaten it. And when one of the journalists asked him to describe the experience, he said, and he's not a religious person, but he used the metaphor. He said it was like looking into the mind of God, by which he meant it was a very sophisticated path that no one in the history of chess had ever looked at before. And yet it wasn't all that deep. It was just not uncovered before. Okay, now keep that in mind. That reminds me of actually a joke about looking down into this cone. Reminds me of these, remember this, I don't want to tell the whole long joke, but it's about these two guys in the mountains who are hiking, and they take their shoes off and go wash themselves in the river, and then there's a bear and they have to run away from the bear, and one guy starts to run away, but the other guy sits down on a rock and puts on his shoes, and the other guy yells at him, hey, what are you doing? Don't you want to run away from that bear? He says, no, my job is just to run faster than you. Well, the same thing with this looking down into the cone of one of these spaces. To get better than people, you don't have to go too far. You just have to get further than any of you can go, or than Kasparov can go, or that the best physicist can go, or the best mathematicians. So, two other stories. One will be visual. There's a very, very smart guy, was a young guy, now isn't, Doug Lenett, I mentioned it before, doing his thesis. And he did his thesis was not to look for an elegant proof of a theorem, look for a theorem that was interesting to prove. A theorem that was interesting to prove. So he had to have criteria of interestingness in theoremness. And he did that. It's called AM, Automated Mathematician. And what are the chances that a Ph.D. student can stumble on anything that was new to mankind, right? 0. Well, one day, Doug came across something which the program declared was very interesting. And Doug had never seen it before, had never even heard of it before. He took that to, now who in the computer science department would you go to if you had one of these things? You'd go to Don Knuth, right? He took it to Don Knuth. Don had never seen it before. So it looked like, for a moment, that it was new to mankind. Well, it actually wasn't. It was first stumbled upon by the great Indian mathematician Ramanujan. And Ramanujan had looked at it, proved a few things about it, about that kind of entity, and then dropped it. And no one else had worked on it since. So, although it wasn't totally new to mankind, it was really rare. And that was done in Doug's thesis was 1976 through 1978. So we're not talking about anything really modern. Okay, now, to use his terminology, fast forward. 1972, with a long story behind it that I won't tell you, I stumbled upon an artist, now a very good friend of mine and Gordon Bell's, named Harold Cohen, who was a well-known young British artist at the time, but he had moved to the University of California, San Diego to head their art department. And he was particularly known as a major colorist. Harold had stumbled on the writings of Newell and Simon and realized that, gee, you know, if those guys are making models of minds like Bertrand Russell's mind or a chess player's mind, why can't I, Harold Cohen, make a model of my own mind? What am I doing? What is in my head? What's going on there when I'm drawing things? And so he started to, well, he conceived of doing it, and then I met him and invited him to come up to the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Lab, where we could give him the computers and the techniques and the Lisp and the teaching and all that. And he took it all back to San Diego 2 years later and continued working on it, and he's still working on it. Well, his system over the years, one-man system, he's writing all the programs, just like Michelangelo chipped all the marble off the stone by himself, didn't have anyone helping him. He ended up having a rule-based system with thousands and thousands and thousands of rules, many, many, many of which were rules about coloring. He started out his work without the complications of color, because that's quite complicated. But under the influence of myself, Penny, Gordon, and others, he built a painting robot that was first exhibited at the Computer Museum in Boston. And Harold has had shows all over the world, but one day Harold sent my wife Penny and I a slide. Oh, you better bring it up here. And this was Harold's gift, but this was done by Harold's program, Aaron, a huge expert system and the longest-lived expert system in the history of AI. And what's so interesting about this is that when Harold and I and Penny went over pieces of this, you can come up later and see it, but we went over pieces of this thing, like in here and in here and in here. The colorations are amazingly interesting. And Harold, even though he is a major colorist, he said that he would not have the guts to have put those colors together like that. It was that rule-based system that didn't know enough not to put those together. Now, what I'm asserting is that what Aaron did here was a creative act, and that the move that beat Kasparov in Game 3 of that championship was a creative move. And I'm interested in what's called combinatorial creativity, where it may not be all of creativity, but it's the creativity of putting together new things out of parts you already know about. But you can't conceive of how to defeat the combinatorics to get at an avenue which is totally wonderful and interesting and novel and brilliant and a surprise to mankind. That's what those are the problems I would work on.
I think that's a great note. upon which to conclude our conversation.
Oh, but you didn't let me say what I told the Pope.
Would you like to say?
No, I really have to finish this Pope
Would you like
story.
to say what you told the Pope?
He wouldn't let me tell the Pope story at the beginning. Guess why the Pope had us all there? When I say all of us, actually it's a few miscreants like me, and all the rest were Nobel Prize winners, literally. But there is no Nobel Prize in computer science, and the organizers wanted to hear something about AI, and so I was there as well. But the Pope called this meeting in honor of the 350th anniversary of the publication of Galileo's A Dialogue of the Two Great World Systems, the book that eventually got him into deep trouble with the church. And the question the Pope was raising was, is it time for the church to back off and decide that Galileo really was not heretical in publishing this book on its 350th anniversary? I gave a talk on AI, but I finished the talk by, Arnold loves this, by spelling out what I thought were the really great problems of mankind, of all of us. One is the origins of the universe. And remember, we're talking about here, I think this was like 1983, that 84 maybe, when this conference was being held, although Galileo, the 350th birthday would have been 82, but I think it was a little bit later than that we had this conference. But look what cosmology has done since then. I mean, we almost know the answer now. And then the second big question was the nature of life. How did life come about? And how does it develop? Well, think of all that's gone on in molecular biology since 1982, 3, and 4. I mean, we're closing in on those answers very fast. And the third one is, what is the nature of thought? What is intelligence? Why are we, what allows us to be here, to understand those things like the nature of the universe? What do we have up here that does that? And those are the really great problems. Well, the Pope, I'm sure he loved that, but what he really said was he's going to set up a committee to study the Galileo thing, and it should report back to him in 7 years. And actually, more than 7 years has gone by. So the committee actually did report to him. And what it reported to him was they should study it some more and make a decision on the 400th anniversary of Galileo's publication of Two Great World Systems.
So Ed told the Pope to think about the universe, life, and thought. Now that seems an auspiciously high enough note upon which to end this conversation. Thank you, Ed.